as historians, we use primary sources to corroborate, to test, to challenge secondary source interpretations. When we're looking at Jim Crow laws, after we've defined the concept and know where the concept applies, it's important for us to start seeing actual examples. And those actual examples are written in legislation. It's great for historians to know that the actual thing they're looking for is written down in the words of their creators. Laws are fabulous for pointing out elements of Jim Crow law. So one of the first things we need to know is that the laws are easy to find. They're printed in books, they're available online, and I've gone to Green and Cheatham's book again, this one, where a lot of really good examples of Jim Crow laws are located. There's page upon page of them, but we can find these statutes, we can find these laws printed into government documents across the United States. They're not hard to locate at all. There are plenty of Jim Crow laws available to be seen. How widespread are they? Well, we know Jim Crow laws were in place throughout the South, in particular in the United States. So let's quickly test that hypothesis against these sources. Under each extract of law in Green and Cheatham's book is where it's from. Louisiana, Alabama again, Arkansas, North Carolina, Virginia. We've got it in the Constitution of Mississippi here from the previous page. So yes, we're seeing it's from across the South. Let's now have a look at what these laws were set up to do. We know they were supposed to oppress African Americans. We know they were meant to separate and segregate. We know they were meant to keep African Americans in a separate economic, occupational class than white Americans. So let's now have a look how that plays out with each of these sources. First one, really important to pick up on. In Louisiana, railway companies have to provide separate coaches, separate carriages for white and coloured. They need to provide 2 or more passenger coaches for every passenger train, so 1 each, or divide the coaches with a partition, so there are separate accommodations. No one was allowed to occupy the seats in coaches other than the ones that are assigned to them on the account of race. Now this is echoing Plessy versus Ferguson, the start of separate but equal. It picks up on that idea of equal but separate, separate but equal, so you can see that clearly Louisiana's state government is looking at that previous court decision and that legal principle. And what we're actually also seeing here is something that we need to be aware of when we start looking at Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, which was challenging the separate but equal seating arrangements on buses in Montgomery. Let's move on to the next. The next Alabama law is relating to interracial marriage, miscegenation. The legislature, that is, the lawmaking body, the Congress of Alabama, is being said under its constitution, the state's laws that set the state up. Legislature shall never pass any law to authorize or legalize any marriage between a white person and a Negro or a descendant of a Negro. That would be covering mixed race people. Social segregation. Scanning down, also in the Constitution of Alabama. So these aren't just the laws, these are the laws that set up the laws. The legislature is going to organise and maintain a system of public schools for the benefit of children. Seems reasonable at the start, but look at that second bit I've highlighted in green. Separate schools shall be provided for white and coloured children, and no child of either race shall be permitted to attend schools of that other race. We're clearly getting a sense of Jim Crow laws operating now. Let's move on a little further. This time we're talking about Arkansas, and it's talking about prisons. The state penitentiary in all county jails, stockades, convict camps, and other places where state or county prisoners are confined, they must operate in a way that provides separate apartments, okay, for white and Negroes. That means they're going to have separate bunks, separate bedding, separate dining tables, Separate furniture, all separate. That last line's interesting. It's going to be unlawful, even in prisons, for a white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained tied to a Negro prisoner. This is Jim Crow in action in Arkansas. North Carolina, interesting again because it's relating to transport, and we know this is going to relate to some of the civil rights battles of the 1960s. All street, like tram, all street and inner urban railway companies, okay, they shall set apart a front portion of each car operated by them for the occupation of white passengers, and likewise will provide and set apart a rear part of the car for the occupation by coloured passengers. Now, looking ahead, we know Rosa Parks challenges the bus system, legally quite similar to a tram system, of Montgomery by sitting in the white seats at the front of the bus when she should have been sitting, by law at least, in the area of coloured seating at the back of the bus. This becomes one of the early battles, and you can see how segregation is impacting upon, by law, every element of the lives of African Americans. Where you live was also separated, and this is Virginia. Now, Virginia is quite north in the southern states. In the cities and towns of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's interesting that some of the United States are actually commonwealths, and we could go on a big sidetrack there, but we won't. But in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we'd think of it as a state. In the cities and towns, the entire area within the different limits of each town shall be divided into districts, and those districts will be designated as segregation districts. So they give it a little bit of a time phase for this to be set up in 1912, but it'll be unlawful for any coloured person not living in a district defined and designated as unlawful for a coloured person to go into a district or live in a district defined and designated as a white district, and vice versa. A white person is not allowed to live in a district designated as African American. Now, let's then think about how important these laws were in the South. I've just highlighted a couple there, and I could have also highlighted the Constitution of Mississippi up the top. These are in the foundation documents of some of the states. These aren't afterthought ideas. These are embedded into the very foundational documents, the documents that required or allowed the legal setup of the states. These are at the heart of those southern states' social systems. Let's now push on to a few more examples. I want you to be thinking about how you might use these as quotes. What are the good quotes you might work into assignment work, into essay work, into paragraphs? Again, throughout the South. We're seeing Louisiana, Oklahoma, technically not part of the South. Mississippi, what's often referred to as the Deep South. Kentucky and North Carolina. These states are where we're seeing quite a lot of segregation going on, even when they are not necessarily referred to as South. Oklahoma is a good example of that one. In public entertainment, and this would impact in other states in areas like cinemas, there'll be 2 ticket offices, and they are not allowed to be less than 25 feet apart. The separate entrances will be created for people that enter circuses and exhibitions in tents and so on. Going on, telephone booths in Oklahoma. Where you're going to have enough demand for telephone booths, and in black areas I might suggest that there wouldn't be enough demand, where there is enough room, you will have white telephone booths and black telephone booths. And there are some interesting photographs out there where you've got a phone or 2 phones on a wall of not equal quality on the wall, one for white use, one for black use. Here's an interesting one that impacted upon the civil rights movement itself in Mississippi. Any person, firm, corporation, organisation, who shall be guilty of printing, publishing, circulating printed, typewritten or written matter, urging or presenting for public acceptance or general information, arguments, or suggestions in favour of social equality or of intermarriage between whites and Negroes shall be guilty of a misdemeanour, a crime, and go to jail for suggesting in written form that African Americans and white Americans are equal. And that's exactly what the civil rights movement does in Mississippi later on. Remember, Mississippi has a number of murders, extra-legal means of keeping people in their place. One that relates to schools is below. Oh, by the way, I've marked this one as a particularly important source. I'd bracket around it. If I was doing research, I'd say, hey, that's a really important source that I can refer back to later on. Talking about textbooks in schools. Textbooks distributed to white kids can't be reissued for coloured kids, African American kids in their schools. And likewise, no textbook given to an African American child is allowed to be reused in a white school. Lastly, one that caused a lot of African Americans to just shake their head, racial restrictions and segregation applied even in cemeteries. That white people and African American people, even after they were dead, needed to be buried in separate cemeteries. That once African Americans had been buried in an area as a African American cemetery, no white person could be buried in that same space. So you had separate churchyards, separate cemeteries, separate public cemeteries, separate crematoriums across the South, because white people and African Americans could not be buried together. Now, just so you've got your head around this in terms of how important and how late these laws are coming in, we're not talking about things that happened in the 19th century. That last law, 1947. That's after World War II. These laws are coming into well into the I guess now the 20th century. How are they enforced? These laws are enforced by law, so police could arrest you, courts would enforce it, people would go to jail over it, but the extra legal means might include lynching, named after an 1800s soldier, Colonel Lynch. Lynching was where a mob of people found a person that they felt had broken the segregation laws and most commonly hung them from a tree. And this became almost a community gathering in the South. There's quite a lot of information on lynching, as you can see in this image, and it's quite a disturbing image. We've got white people standing around a body hanging from the tree. There seems to be no concern that photographs are being taken, and you might also notice they've even taken their children along to the lynching. Very, very disturbing images. Now we've got perhaps a more full image of what is meant by Jim Crow laws and segregation in the South.